Costas, are you going to... Are you going to make an announcement, or do you just want me to start? Okay.
Hi.
Okay, everybody, we're going to start.
Yeah, but I do know about you actually.
Start.
I was looking at the Oxford website and I found your research.
Okay, well, greetings, everybody. We are on our third day, our last day of the conference, Reinforcing, Crossing, and Transcending Borders, Soccer in a Globalized World. So we have two panels today, a roundtable discussion of players, and then a match. That's when, you know, we really find out who we are. Okay, so our third panel today is on fandom, and I assume you're all fans, right? I mean, that's why you're here, right? We're fans. So we're going to get a little bit of a theoretical take and a historical take on what it means to be a fan. So we have a very distinguished panel this morning. Our first panelist is Tama Rappaport. She is an emerita at Hebrew University, teaching lately at Columbia. During her academic career as a cultural sociologist, she has conducted research on various topics, among them informal organizations, gender, society, immigration. What haven't you done, Tamar? Several years ago, she started to conduct an ethnographic study on fandom in Apol, Kataman, Jerusalem, a football club in Jerusalem, a Fandom football club in Jerusalem, and she became a fan of the club and owns this year. So you're an owner. Okay, that's good. Last year, she edited a book on fandom, Football Logs to the Fans, an investigative journey following HTT, was published in Hebrew, is now translated into English. Fan-owned clubs and fandom in general have become her major academic interest. Our second panelist is Rohan Sengupta, and I asked him first before saying this, so I can say it. He's an Indian scholar. This is his first time outside of India. So this is has been a nice experience for him. He has a BA in sociology from the Department of Sociology at the Presidency University, an MA in sociology from the School of Liberal Arts of Ambedkar University in Delhi. Currently, he is studying for an MPhil in the social sciences at the Center for Studies in Calcutta. His current research traces the politics of public culture through the lens of football fandom in Calcutta from 1957 until 2011. In his thesis, he looks at the interface of language and mass media and tries to argue for the role of publics as a site of political mediation. More specifically, he looks at how running commentary and radio in the vernacular stadium as the site of support and organized fans clubs together constitute fandom as a category of analysis in shaping the politics of public culture in contemporary Calcutta. So our third panelist is John McManus. He's a social anthropologist specializing in the study of sport, digital media, and migration in Turkey and the Turkish diaspora. John receives his PhD from the University of Oxford. His thesis entitled Playing the Game, a study of transnational Turkish football fans' imaginations in the internet, explores how the internet affects the generation of football fan clubs in the Turkish diaspora. He is currently working on a book, Welcome to Hell. We may all feel that way right now. In Search of the Real Turkish Football, about the history and culture of football in Turkey, to be published with Orient Books in 2018. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Manasi Chiweshi, is a senior lecturer in the Institute of Lifelong Learning and Development Studies at the Chinhoyi University of Technology. He's an African scholar with an interest in agrarian studies, sustainable livelihoods, sports and fan studies, urban sociology, gender, and youth studies. You do a lot, Manase. His other interest in, he has published on gender and agrarian issues and also an advocate for youth rights in Zimbabwe. Dr. Chiweshi's work revolves around the sociology of everyday life, in African spaces with a special focus on promoting African ways of knowing. His recent work is concentrated on large-scale land deals and use in agriculture with a special focus on girls. And I want to make a note that the panelists were all asked to sort of deliver a very public lecture. So if you have any questions about the theoretical basis of what they'll be presenting today, please don't hesitate to ask. Some of the theory was taken out so to make it more accessible to sort of people who are not academics. So welcome to our panelists, and first, Tamar Rappaport.
It's customary to start by thanking everybody that made my life here a pleasure. It's really a pleasure in every possible sense. So thank you for everybody, especially to Steve and the other people for their hospitality. It's very generous, it's very wonderful. And to all my colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you. I wrote this paper with my colleague, friend, and student, Daniel Regev. He couldn't come, so I present the paper in the name of both of us. But I will talk probably about I or me, but it's a common paper. Our presentation examines the role of national and international organizations in creating a global space of fandom. The protagonist is Murtaza Ahmadi, this is the child, an Afghan child who loves football and worships Lionel Messi. Our tale's other main character is Lionel Messi, the hero of Murtaza. Murtaza and Messi are joined in this tale by social media, football club administrators, and several national and international organizations, primarily UNICEF, a National Football Federation of Barca and Qatar. You might wonder why the tale of one child from a poor village interests us academically. For us social researchers, Murtaza's fair tale is a goldmine. Before I start digging into the analysis, let me first narrate the tale of Murtaza the way it unfolded chronologically. The main aim is to follow the course of events that turned Murtaza, the child fan, into a celeb fan. After the fairy tale, I will introduce our initial academic insights. Well, enough with introduction, now on to the tale itself. Once upon a time, in a remote run-down village in Afghanistan, a vivacious, charming boy called Murtaza Ahmadi was born. It was 2010. Just as soon as he could walk, Murtaza started playing football in the yard next to his parents' home. Watching matches of the 2014 World Cup with his father and brother on TV, Murtaza was captivated by Lionel Messi. At this time, Messi was playing in the Argentinian national team. Murtaza became infatuated with Messi. Messi became his hero, his role model. Murtaza dreamt of meeting Messi and becoming a football star like him. The kickoff of Murtaza's long journey to meet Messi was his asking his father to buy him the number 10 jersey. The poor family didn't have the money, and the closest town where they could buy a shirt was too far away anyway. So Murtaza's brother, Humayun, age 15, tailored a jersey for him out of a blue and white striped plastic. On the back, he fastened the number 10 and added on the front the name Messi. You can see it here. Murtaza was delighted. He wore the jersey every time he played in the yard and also when he went to sleep. Murtaza's brother took photos of him holding and wearing the plastic shirt and then posted them on the social media. Very soon after, the photos went viral. At this point, big organizations, especially UNICEF and the Afghan Football Association, became interested in the so-called plastic bag boy. The organization, thanks to the effort of the organization, the photo reached Messi. The superstar sent Murtaza the official Barca and Argentinian Messi, jersey, as well as a real football signed by Messi. Nearly a year after the photo went viral, Murtaza was invited by the Qatari Football Federation to meet Messi. Barca officials, UNICEF, and the Qatari Football Federation collaborated in financing the trip and hosting Murtaza. The legendary player and his young Afghan fan met face-to-face in Qatar on December 13, 1916, at an exhibition match between Barca and Al-Ahly from Saudi Arabia. Murtaza held Messi's hand as we went yesterday to the pitch. As they entered the pitch, smiling and very happy. The warm, romantic encounter on the pitch between the legendary player and his cute young admirer was widely documented. These photos gained enormous coverage and went viral too. Sorry? It has been over 2 years since the photos of the plastic shirt boy were posted, were posted on Twitter. During this time, Murtaza's family experienced great upheaval. They had to move from Afghanistan to Pakistan because of telephone threats they received, including threats to kidnap Murtaza. In Pakistan, the family moved from the capital Islamabad, where they lived only briefly due to adjustment difficulties, to Pakistan village called Quetta. And here our story ends, at least for now. We do not know what has happened to Murtaza and his family. Academics, we read the story of Murtaza as a fairy tale, a story in which, and I cite, improbable events lead to a happy ending. Why does the world like Murtaza fairy tale? Why does it make people feel good or even feel hope? It is not only because of the happy ending and not only because Messi has a role in it. It is the story of a cute, poor, naive child who rose to fame and became a king for one day. A poor boy from a decent village whose dream came true. In the tale, we read about organizations, big powers, that stepped forward to do good by fulfilling a child's wish. Adults are reminded of their childhood dream of becoming a football player and of their worship of a player. What is lacking in the story helps further contribute to the good feeling. It lacks traces of meanness or cruelty, manipulation or power, interest or abuse. Readers find it easy to identify with Murtaza and, of course, with Messi. Most people will simply move on after reading or hearing the story and being very warmed by it. This is exactly the point where our work as social scientists begins. After piecing the story together based on internet coverage, we put our critical academic eye to work. We lifted the carpet to reveal the less glamorous side of Murtaza's tale. We asked, for instance, what drove Mustafa's family to cross borders into Pakistan. Which forces were involved in this move? All we know is that the father said they had to leave because of repeated telephone threats to kidnap the child. This is certainly not enough. Not enough as information, sorry. Excuse me. What role did Murtaza's mother play in the story? There are no women in the story. Where did the women disappear? We then embark on a journey in which we try to discover what actually lies under and beyond this fairy tale. To analyze and critique it, to identify the interconnections between organizations, the winners and losers, and the knowledge gaps in the investigation. What happens to children, refugees, and child celebs in whom the media takes an interest after the media shut off its lens? They are the blind spots and black holes that social scientists seek to locate. Our main claim is that the seemingly straightforward plot of Murtaza's fairy tale helps us to better understand issues in today's world of globalized football. Among these issues are power relations, interest and motivation, as well as the operation and meaning of the overall network of organizations in the current football world. Once we start digging into the story, it might also help us to understand how football fandom has become a globalized force, a force with potential positive and negative effects. In what follows, I demonstrate that academic research might contribute to the preliminary analysis to shed light on the key subject in the interface of fandom and globalization. It is important for me to emphasize again and again that our analysis is partial and preliminary. There is more work to be done. I start with talking about the politics of fandom. All organizations and agencies that played a part in fulfilling Murtaza's dream are highly politicized. There is nothing in their action or interests that is politically free. Each organization hopes to reap rewards from its intervention and expression of empathy to Murtaza. This doesn't exclude the possibility that they have good intention and that their efforts to improve human condition are sincere. In fact, practical and even instrumental interest in doing good coexist. All the different organizations in our tale are engaged in doing good. In the public eye, they performed an ethical human act in their caring for Murtaza and his family. This organization, Barça, Qatar, and UNICEF included, have a well-oiled public relations department that spends a great deal of money and effort to make sure that they will be recognized and remembered as doing good, as serving the best interests and needs of the community and individuals, particularly those that are seen as in need. For some time, the three organizations have formed a triangular network. Their interrelation is inscribed on the Barça jersey. Messi himself embodies the cooperation of Barça and UNICEF in fulfilling his role of a goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. Messi is involved in advocacy and fundraising for the organization. If you look good, if you really search very carefully, he's involved very little. But he's known as very much involved. Helping a child like Murtaza is part of UNICEF's social political agenda. It is almost expected that it will take part in the collective effort to make sure that Murtaza will meet Messi. UNICEF presents itself as an organization that protects and defends the right of every child, as providing humanitarian development assistance to children and mothers in developing countries, as protecting and defending the rights of every child. In the case of Murtaza, UNICEF fulfilled his right to fulfill his dream. For many years, the UNICEF logo, as all of you know, or most of you know, was impressed on the front of the Barca jersey. Then the logo was moved to the back of the jersey, and then Qatar Airways logo was moved to the front. Qatar paid 35 million euro per year for being on the front. Heated debates between Barca fans followed this change, and it was discussed in national and international papers and internet sites. The Barca club was accused of deserting its social ideals for money. In the 2017-19 season, Qatar Airways disappeared from the front of the shirt, and Rakuten, the giant Japanese electronic commerce and internet company, is paying much to have its logo exhibited on the front. Qatar is slated to host the FIFA World Cup in 2022. Facing allegations of slave labor, bribery, and corruption, Qatar's hosting of Murtaza is a calculated attempt to improve its reputation worldwide. What drove them to invest in the child is the idea that doing good looks good and feels good. According to the discussion in the literature on organization, doing good, whether for workers, the community, whatever, in our case for Murtaza, the organization does well by doing good, or in other words, it is doing well by doing good. Thus, often doing good and doing well are codependent. In the case of Qatar, the fairy tale becomes a symbol of severe diplomatic conflict with Saudi Arabia. The shirt becomes a political symbol. Now I'm talking a little about a shirt as a political agent. Like the hijab and other items, clothing is used as a symbolic weapon in different contexts, especially in gender, but I'm not going to get into it today. Following the severeness of political relation between the two countries, the Saudis threatened to punish anyone wearing a Barca jersey that wears the Qatar Airways logo. The punishment would be, they said, a huge fine of 15 years in jail. The official jersey of any club is a global uniform whose symbolism is familiar to everyone. It signifies one's belonging to a club, one's being a fan with affinity for a particular player. Kids and adults the world over feel proud to wear the jersey, which makes them feel part of an imagined fan community, both local and worldwide. As a symbol of belonging, the jersey grants fans at the local level the status of world citizens, connecting them to other fans in the same club or other clubs, wherever they may be. Making a jersey out of a plastic bag is a creative endeavor that saves money. It seems Murtaza was happy with both the official jersey and its plastic bag replica. We assume that homemade jersey is mainly worn by children in what is often called developed countries or third world countries. The families of most of them do not have the means to buy a real thing for the children. According to the internet, a number 10 jersey costs 75 euros or more. There is a substantial difference in the ability to buy the shirt between Murtaza and his peers in developing countries and children elsewhere. Yet there is no difference between them in terms of their fandom. If they should meet, the young fans will speak the same language of fandom. In one way, the jersey then is an equalizer across the globe, but is also an economic differentiator. The signed shirt and other merchandise received by Murtaza and his family from Messi have substantial financial and symbolic value in the global market. Yet we have no idea how they have or how they will influence Murtaza and his family in his family's life, the financial situation or future in general. The merchandise could be put up for auction, displayed at Barca or another museum, or be saved in a cupboard by the family as a souvenir for generations. It could also be stolen, and threats of kidnapping Murtaza might continue. The merchandise might put heavy weight on Murtaza's shoulders when he grows up. Maybe also traumatic. We are well aware that the information we have is incomplete due to the scarcity and quality of available sources. As I said, the Murtaza fairy tale and its analysis are based on the communication of multiple news agencies, all publishing in English. We have not yet found any academic reference to the story. We reviewed all the material we could find on the electronic media and printed newspaper, and there was a lot. If we could read coverage in other languages, especially in Afghan language, Spanish and Arabic, etc., and Pakistani, we could no doubt gain additional perspective on the fairy tale. So a real research is almost impossible. In the media sources that we study, Murtaza's tale was presented like a Hollywood celeb story, the same way of coverage. Written in a sentimental, romantic tone, the texts are often short or on detail and shallow in approach. It was clear that no attempt had been made to conduct an investigated research on the story. We are left with the feeling of wanting to know more. What has happened to Murtaza and his family since the cameras stopped taking their photos? I'm finishing in a second. Where are the women who are never mentioned or photographed? Have any organizations stayed in touch with the family? To find out, we would need to talk with Messi and his assistants, which I would love, with officials in Qatar and UNICEF. I cannot go to Qatar because of my Israeli passport, and even visit the families to homes. I cannot go there either. We would very much like to do all this, but we are almost sure this is a mission impossible. Even if we didn't travel and send questionnaires instead, our experience tells us that this wouldn't work because people simply don't answer. So what have we learned? Murtaza Innocent Fandom set a chain, mobilized a chain of events into motion, one child into motion. The social media circulated the fantastic story in photos. This exposure, together with the involvement of national and international organizations, made this story a sensation. They loved the fairy tale. In the course of 2 years, the meaning of the plastic shirt, both symbolic and actual, has transformed. From the day Humayun created it for his little brother until Murtaza wore it in Qatar, we can assume that it will continue to affect the families, maybe the village, into the future. We have no idea whether we'll know about it. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter. On? Okay. Our next presenter will be Rohan Sengupta. Thank you.
Right. Good morning. So this is actually the first time out of India for me personally, so it has thus far been a surreal experience.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Weathered Initiative on Global History at Harvard University, the Simmons College, and especially Olympiacos FC for this wonderful conference that they've organized. It is a fantastic setting for me personally and also professionally because I'm presenting in front of not only stalwarts and academics who I have not only read and cited, but also players like Christian Karembeu and Lilian Thuram, with whom I've played on FIFA. So this setting is particularly very interesting for me. I am currently an MPhil student. I haven't started my PhD yet. And what I'm working on for my MPhil is on organized fandom. What I'll be presenting today is a very tiny portion of that thesis, right? So with regards to this particular presentation, I want to talk about the category of fandom. And I will mostly be talking about two distinct kinds of fan clubs or supporters in that regard. On the left, you have a local variant called East Bengal Ultras, and on the right, you have the Chelsea Supporters Club of India, Kolkata. Now, why these two? What are the specific politics, cultural histories, and all of that? I'll briefly talk about it, but this is what I am going to try and do in this presentation. Right. So I'm working on fandom, and when I say fandom, I don't just mean something that is taken for granted in a very commonsensical way. It is not just a question of people coming together and supporting a team. I'm trying to look at the politics and trying to unearth some of the political angles to it. What is it that we mean when we say fandom? So I want to stress on the plural form of the word, which is fandom in that regard, and not just fans. With regards to this particular conference theme of the conference, what I'm trying to show is how is fandom helping us in trying to understand the question of borders as something which is not only reinforced or transcend, but both at the same time. And in trying to do so, I'll talk about what is it that really is at stake when we talk about fandom. Why must research be done on fandom with regards to the question of fandom, not just as something which is very simplistic and taken for granted, but as something which has a lot of political, cultural, and social angles to it. This particular presentation, in this presentation, I'll just talk about, thank you. In this presentation, I'll just talk about two particular themes that I want to really touch upon. One is the question of the region as opposed to the question of the nation. I don't really want to delve into the question of the nation in this presentation, but I want to talk about something which is a lot more local, which is understood as something which is regional in that front, and not something which is national or nationalistic or transnational in that regard. I have refrained from using these phrases because I don't think I can qualify these terms well enough in the presentation. So I would rather want to talk about the question of the region and how it is precisely something which is very local, something which is very identity-oriented, something which is very particular, can go on to become something which is very global at the same time. And the second category that I am trying to deal with is the question of fans and ultras as distinctions of a kind of support which are not really the same. They're different. And ultras is something which is not specific to Kolkata. There are other places also. There are other ultras also which are there across the globe. So I won't talk about it as a specific thing, but I want to talk about the combined setting of what you have when you talk about local ultras like something called the East Bengal Ultras and the Chelsea Supporters Club at the same time in the same place, sharing different stadiums and supporters clubs at the same time. So I'll begin by talking about East Bengal Football Club. Now, anyone who has worked on any scholar who's remotely familiar with South Asian history will know that East Bengal Football Club is predominantly understood, popularly called a refugee club in that regard. It is not an official category. It is a more it has garnered a more popular connotation to it, right? So I'll talk about East Bengal Football Club before I begin to talk about ultras, because unless I talk about this, I won't be able to give you a very decent context. So the East Bengal Football Club was established in 1920. This is when the British were in India. India was colonized by the British. So the question of football in its emergence in Bengal had its roots right in the colonial project itself. It was introduced in the 1950s as a procedure to make Bengali upper class Hindu men more masculine, right? So one of the first reasons why football was taken up as a sport in Kolkata, in Bengal, in general, was more of a cultural masculine response to the British. So you step out on the field against the British to try and prove that you are worthy of self-independence, but more immediately to compete with them on the field itself. It is popularly known as a refugee club because of its history. It was predominantly supported by people from East Pakistan, and it has garnered a more unanimous sense of cultural identity ever since that. So the Calcutta Derby is something which is very famous in Calcutta. Calcutta is famous for its football, but I'll talk about it later. Calcutta is very famous for its football, and the Derby is between East Bengal, which is largely a refugee migrant orientation to it, and that is the cultural connotation that it has, with Mohun Bagan, which is the natives, simply put, right? So with regards to this particular sport in general, there is something that I want to touch upon, and that is football is not as famous in India as it is popular in Calcutta. You don't really have football being played by every major metropolitan city. You don't have it which is half as popular as in Calcutta or in another place called Kerala. Right? So I will not talk when I'm talking about fandom, I'm not talking about football in India, I'm talking about football in Calcutta, and that is something which is very specific to my current presentation at this point in time. When I said that football was introduced in the 1950s, in the 1850s in Calcutta, in Bengal rather, the first response was the masculine response, but in 1911, Mohun Bagan, which I won't be talking about in the presentation. In 1911, Mohun Bagan defeated the East Yorkshire Regiment 2-1 and to win the IFA Shield, and it became the first Indian team to win the IFA Shield. Now, within the current political scenario, that took on very large nationalist implications. So, if the larger feeling was that if we can beat the British on the football field, we can beat them politically, and we can achieve independence. And this is largely what a lot of scholarship on the history of football spectatorship talks about. Something that, of course, is important, but one has to move beyond questions of spectatorship, and that's why I'm looking at something which is distinct from spectatorship, the idea of fandom. So the 1920s was a time, the 1920s was when East Bengal was established, and it used to play in the second division of the league then. The first major victory was the IFA Shield victory that took place in 1940s. Now, the 1940s through to the 1970s is largely understood as the golden period of club football in Calcutta. This is when there were three major clubs who were right at their very pomp, playing to the top of their game, all three at the same time, with three distinct identity-oriented backgrounds, and playing out their identity. I can't say identity politics, but there was a very obvious sense of cultural identity which was attached to it. So the three clubs that I talk about, one is Mohun Bagan, which was largely supported, and a lot of the players were also Bengali Hindu natives, right? The second club, which I haven't spoken about, is Mohammedan Sporting, which was largely supported by Bengali Muslims. And this is both refugee and native Muslims. But East Bengal, the club that I want to focus upon, was mostly formed by upper caste Bengali Hindu refugees. So this is the context, a very simplified context in which local support became very, very famous. And I have a couple of slides which talks about East Bengal and the way in which the club is really enmeshed within cultural identities with regards to Bengal. This is in one of the traditionally understood refugee localities of Calcutta, where you have the East Bengal fan, and this is another club in a traditional. This is the flag in a traditional North Calcutta house, and it's entirely commonplace to see settings like this if you walk around Calcutta. It is the same for Mohun Bagan, not so much for Mohammedan Sporting. So it is something which is very regional in that sense. Calcutta is a setting of different kinds of identities, which makes it a lot more enmeshed. It is very difficult to talk about these identities as neat categories. So you don't just have one category supported by one club and the other category supported by the other. It is a lot more, it mixes a lot because of, well, the same language, different, mostly similar language, religion, and questions of food, of course. But this presentation is mostly about fandom, so I'll quickly go back to East Bengal Ultras, which is, so this is one of the pictures of the East Bengal Ultras, which was released on their Facebook page. The East Bengal Ultras really identify themselves not as an organized fan club, but a movement, which is what they want to tie to other movements across the globe. So if it so happens that a lot of East Bengal fans usually go to the Ultras and say, so how do I become a member of the East Bengal Ultras? And they're like, no, listen, don't talk to us about membership. We are not an organized fan club. We are a movement. Please be a part of the movement. We want you to come to the stadium. We want you to come to the club grounds, and we want you to support, and that's it. We won't take money. We won't charge money, and that's it. This is not an officially recognized supporters club of East Bengal. East Bengal Football Club has a different supporters club, which is officially recognized. It's called East Bengal Real Powers. So it's not the official fan club, and that fan club is not as vocal or is not as administratively functional as the East Bengal Ultras, and they do. I mean, they do a whole host of things, starting from blood donation to different kinds of social events with regards to East Bengal. It's more of trying to harness an image of East Bengal club as a completely unproblematic and very, peaceful club in that regard. The East Bengal Ultras talk about their distinction from different other forms of fan clubs by stating that we are the only Ultras which travels across the country to watch our teams play. Now, this might be, this might seem fairly commonsensical to a gathering like this, where people are usually familiar with supporters and fans traveling to different parts of the country, even the continent, to support their teams. But the idea of actually traveling with your team wherever they go, rather traveling not with your team, but traveling with the Ultras wherever they go, is something which is particularly novel. Also because it is the only fan club in that regard which is completely, which is not official, and it's not sponsored by the club. So they spend money out of their own pockets, sometimes travel in trains. There have been instances where East Bengal Ultras have not been allowed to enter the stadium of major prominent Indian clubs, because this is the most vocal and the most masculine and vociferous kind of supporters club that you usually see. So they have a lot of grievances against the administration on different fronts, not only because they are not recognized, but also because they're not allowed to enter in a lot of these stadiums. So these are just some of the slides that I have, but so on the left is a banner which says "No Pyro, No Party," and they mark their distinction from other fan clubs with smokes and pyros and tifos and etc. in the club grounds. I'll talk about the stadium in just a second, but these are mostly seen in different stadiums across Bengal and in other places also. The image on the right, which basically says Kolkata is ours, it is written in Bangla, and it has been like shaped from the map of Bengal in that regard. And all of these things take place in the stadium itself. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Ultras is a movement that is not particular to Calcutta. It wasn't started in Calcutta, it was started elsewhere in Europe. But what is interesting is that these Ultras form different kinds of, and I quote them, brotherhood with different Ultras at the same time. The following is Persib Bandung Ultras, which is in Indonesia. So this is, I mean, it's a very bad picture because the Persib banner has been cut out. I'm sorry for that. But this is just one instance of different kinds of ultras, fandom or brotherhood that they talk about with regards to the interface of something which is so regional, something which is so enmeshed in cultural identity, and yet it can take on different kinds of globalities with regards to Indonesia, with regards to Europe, different ultras. So this is the larger rationale, the larger mandate of the East Bengal Ultras. But what is interesting is that they have a very unique kind of a relationship with the stadium. Now, I can't make a generalization with regards to South Asia, but definitely in India, you don't have stadiums, you don't have 5 or 6 stadiums in one city. So the idea of the stadium is something which is very, very personal to them, right? So when in the 1940s and the 1950s, most of the football matches would be played in open fields, which was called Maidan, which is it's a vernacular term, which means open fields. So that is where these matches would be played. And now they have both the club grounds and stadiums. The club grounds look like this. That is the East Bengal club ground, and right behind it is the Mohun Bagan club ground. This must be the length of most training pitches that you see. But this is where the most, the loudest forms of support can be witnessed over here, where these club grounds only have regional matches. They have matches which are telecast, which only talk about regional matches within Calcutta. So you don't have national matches in these stadiums because the IFA does not allow it. But what is interesting is that these club grounds are particular to Mohun Bagan. So if Mohun Bagan or East Bengal is not playing in this club ground will not be given in for any other kind of practice, which is not the same for different stadiums, where you see different stadiums being used for different things. This conference is happening in the stadium itself, right? So there are things like this. And these are things which they hold very dear to them. The fact that the club grounds are not usually utilized for most things other than football. So the club grounds are exclusive home grounds in that sense. But what I'm trying to get at is the entire notion of what does it mean to play in your home ground when there are different sites of support, when things can be completely non-supported by the administration, and et cetera, et cetera. The next picture might just be of interest because this was right after a rain-affected match in Calcutta, and this was the stadium. This was the condition of the ground. This is half an hour after the match has ended, and this is the supporters making their way out of the club grounds. The drainage system is not particularly great, so there have been times when people have had to play in similar, slightly better conditions, but the fans still would go for it. Now the club grounds is something which still exists today. The club grounds is still a very important site. They're very closely related. But in the 1980s, the Salt Lake Stadium was set up. And that really was the first transition away from these very local spaces to a shared site of support, where you would have different clubs talk about the Salt Lake Stadium as their home. You would have derbies being played in those matches. You would have different events taking place in the Salt Lake Stadium. So the Salt Lake Stadium was built in 1984, and it is a pretty large stadium. It looks something like this. And this, on the nearer section, you see an entire gallery of East Bengal supporters, and on the farther side, you see Mohun Bagan supporters. And what is interesting is that this stadium, well, until last year, did not have seats. So you would have to sit on the stairs, and often the fans would be open to each other, and there would be a lot of crowd violence in that regard. The FIFA Under-17 World Cup is happening in India right now, and the Salt Lake Stadium has been closed because the final is happening here. So they've actually had to install seats, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to have these matches right here. So it has seats. When it was built, the Salt Lake Stadium could seat around almost 100,000 people. So it was quite interesting in that regard. So I want to keep. I would like you to keep the idea of the stadium and the club grounds and the entire notion of home when I go into the second part of my presentation, which talks about the Chelsea Supporters Club of India, Kolkata, which does recognize themselves as a structured and an organized fan club. It's also one of the 27 officially recognized and registered fan clubs of Chelsea Supporters Club in India. It is a lot more institutionalized in that sense, where the Chelsea Supporters Club of Bombay is the one which establishes contact with Chelsea Football Club in London directly, and then there are 26 other fan clubs, like the one in Kolkata or like the one in Delhi, which are intermediary bodies in that regard, but they organize a lot of activities, and interestingly, they mostly have two kinds of principles that they talk about, which marks their distinction from the East Bengal Ultras form of supporting. One is that they consciously organize football tournaments to promote the idea of football through the actual playing of the game, along with supporting the game at the same time. And the second is the screenings that they organize, which are on an average basis are attended by largely 40 to 50, mostly men, on a 2-weekly basis, because the places where they organize the screenings are slightly expensive in restaurants. So a lot of them are college students, and a lot of them cannot really afford these things on a weekly basis. A few months back, the Chelsea Supporters Club of Calcutta organized the largest fan fest in Eastern India, where they organized a lot of events like football tournaments and quizzes and quiz shows. And this was actually this was on the final day of the Premier League season when Chelsea had won. So it was a very happy occasion for everyone involved in that. So this was actually officially the largest fan fest that was that took place in India. These are just some of the pictures from that. This is right after the celebrations. The cake was delicious, I assure you. This is just after the celebrations, and you see different kinds of materials that are put to use. You have scarves, you have keychains, which are consciously arranged for and promoted for with regards to the idea of supporting them from afar. The entire rationale of having these supporters clubs in an organized sense is that there are a lot of Chelsea, Manchester United, Bayern Munich, Liverpool, Arsenal fans who do not really have the means or the logistical mechanism to go to England, go to Germany, go to Spain and support them. And according to them, it does not make the support any less credible. So the idea is to screen, the idea is to promote matches, the idea is to ensure that people come together and watch these matches together. So that is something which is particular to the question of the supporters clubs in that regard. You have different tournaments which are organized. So this is just one of the. I don't know if Christian's here. Yeah. So this is like Michael Ballack's. This is the team which is formed from Michael Ballack's, and it's not just the Chelsea supporters club which is there in Calcutta. There are different kinds as well, and you have a large organization called Football is in Our Blood, which is across the country, which does not have a regional orientation, which talks about different kinds of fans in one common place, and they actually talk about different forms of support. On the 6th of February last year, they commemorated the Munich air disaster together, and this was when the Manchester United fan club, the Chelsea fan club, the FIOOB, Football is in Our Blood, all of them came together to celebrate this. In more ways than one of the major events in that regard for the Chelsea supporters clubs is to have banners of the Chelsea Supporters Club of Calcutta at Stamford Bridge, and this happened last year when Amy Foster, who is associated with the Chelsea Supporters Club, actually took the banner to Stamford Bridge. I think it is adjacent to the Matthew Harding stand at Stamford Bridge, where this banner is currently at. So if you ever watch Chelsea, you might just have a look at this banner, and this is something of great pride for this particular kind of supporters club. Now, in conclusion, I'd just like to sum up the overall rationale of this of this presentation, where I try to talk about different strands of fandom as something which is how do you talk about fandom when they are both regional and global at the same time? How do you talk about different kinds of support within the same setting with different kinds of clubs and club grounds and different mass media, language? These are things which go on to shape the nuances of fandom. They go on to disrupt the clear notion of politics of fandom as something which is perhaps a two-way relationship between the fans and the club. There are a lot more parties at stake over here where you talk about the way in which fandom gets fractured. What does home support really mean when it comes to actually being able to go to the stadium and not being able to go for the stadium? There are institutional mechanisms which define the act of going to the stadium and not being able to go to the stadium, and that is something that defines their fandom in that regard. And the middle point is something which is very controversial, which is in this entire scenario, nowhere is the question of India driven in to a large extent. Now, the Chelsea Supporters Club of India India has to be in there because of official reasons. But nowhere would you find the invocation of India in that regard. There are very few organized fan clubs of the Indian football team. There are very few organized fan clubs of, let's say, players who play for different clubs in different regions, but who's largely support them because they play for the nation. The nation question is largely limited to when is India going to play the World Cup. And it starts and ends with that. But what is interesting is that the question of fandom perhaps can be looked at as something which is on a similar pedestal to the nation. It is not something which replaces the nation. It is not something which is perhaps below the nation as a category of analysis. And as someone who's interested in the social sciences, someone who largely comes from an academic background, the question of fandom then perhaps has to be, in a certain way, traced empirically and conceptually. And this is what I've tried to do in the presentation. Thank you.
John McManus will be our third speaker.
Great, thank you. Great. Thanks, Steve. And I'd like to begin by thanking everyone involved in organizing this very interesting, stimulating conference. So that's the Weatherhead Initiative of Global History at Harvard, Simmons College, and of course, Olympiacos, and all the people at those various institutions that have helped organize it. These things don't happen without a lot of work, so I'm very appreciative to you all, and thanks for having me. So I'm an anthropologist. So my work is based on ethnographic fieldwork with football fans in Turkey and in Turkish-speaking communities in Europe. So for over 50 years, going to watch a live match Turkish football match in Europe has been a part of diaspora life. But in the 1970s and 80s, people would go with a few friends. They'd get in a car, they'd drive to the game, whether it be in Germany or France or wherever. But since 2000, many of those fans start to attend in organized transnational supporters groups of many hundreds. So this phenomenon is part of what we saw in Rohan's talk just now, this growing trend in transnational football fandom. The Manchester United supporter in Kenya or the Chelsea supporter in Calcutta. But this is slightly different because it's obviously a sort of Turkish language speaking diaspora. And so in this paper, I'm going to kind of explore the technological changes that have kind of what I think have allowed this phenomenon to emerge. And I'm going to show that like the football is an interesting way for diaspora Turks to kind of express themselves and be part of a community. So, first of all, just to give you a bit of background, Turkish-speaking communities, sizable and dispersed across many nations in Europe. So obviously, Germany is by far and away the largest, but also there are sizable Turkish-speaking communities in Britain, France, Austria, Switzerland. We're looking at about 4 to 6 million Turkish speakers. And the reason I say Turkish speakers rather than Turks or Turkish is because a lot of people here are Kurdish, or they are otherwise not necessarily ethnically Turkish. And even though they're referred to as Turkish, often in Europe, that obscures what is actually very diverse communities of people. So I'm going to say Turkish speaker. So when Galatasaray or Fenerbahce or Beşiktaş, the big Turkish teams, when they play games in Europe, if you look at the away end, so like last night we had the Belgian fans were here. If you look at that, when Galatasaray come, some of those people will have come from Turkey, maybe a quarter. But the vast majority of the people in the away end will have come from England or France or Germany to go to the game. So they live in Europe, but they spend their money, time, and energy supporting a Turkish team. And so I have why do they do this? Why support Turkish football teams? So obviously the first reason, which you're probably all thinking of, is, it allows a connection with Turkish ancestry, obviously, like either real or imagined. Also, when I talk to fans, a lot of them talk about in the idiom of family. They feel like the other fans are brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts. There's a very strong sense of the whole experience of being in a fan group is talked about in terms of family in Turkey, and that's an important way that people feel it. And then finally, I think it was maybe Mark yesterday who said it, let's not forget that it's fun. The whole point is that it's the passion and the playfulness of being a football fan. Sometimes, sociological studies, we kind of lose that. We think that it's all about the politics or whatever, but actually, that's not what drives people to do it. I think the vast majority of these people, they go to the games because it's fun. And Turkish football has a reputation for very passionate fans. And I have a short video of taken in 2011 from a game between Beşiktaş, the Turkish team, and Stoke City. And the video is from Stoke-on-Trent. And it's after Beşiktaş have just scored a goal, just to give you an idea of kind of what the experience is like on these terraces. Do we have sound? Oh, sorry. Do we have sound at all? Yeah? It should have... there should be sound then, but yeah. The sound is quite important. Yeah? No? Sorry? Let's have a look. Yeah, it's on the computer. Yep, sure, 1 second. Sorry for this. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a flavor of what it's like on these terraces, quite a male experience, but not exclusively. Lots of touching, lots of jumping. But this is 2011. I just want to take you back and say that for the first Turkish speakers who moved to Europe as migrants in the 60s and 70s, The only way that they could follow their teams were kind of newspapers, which would arrive maybe 2 or 3 days late because they'd come on the plane. They had newspapers and also occasionally the radio. This is one of Turkey's most famous commentators. And occasionally, people, especially in Germany, they could pick up Turkish radio signals on long wave, or occasionally the German media would broadcast games on their special Turkish language programs, which they had in the 60s and 70s. So this was how, you know, people at first kept in touch with their teams at home. And as a result, it's quite difficult. There wasn't really a great sense of attachment to the Turkish teams for a lot of these people. Guys would say, oh, I used to go to Chelsea or Tottenham. I preferred going to watch English football because, you know, you can't really follow them. So the biggest change comes in the 1990s with the arrival of satellite television, Turkish language satellite television. So for the first time in Europe, you can watch games live. And this leads to a configuration, a new spaces in which to watch games. So suddenly, because it's expensive, people don't really have it at home. Places such as coffee houses, male-only spaces start to emerge where people watch games. This is a picture from one in Cologne in 2012. Also, obviously, more of the bar, a bar or pub, a venue that serves alcohol, which might not be an exclusively Turkish clientele. These places they're just Turkish people. This is a bar in Dalston in London, which would show Turkish games. It had a Turkish language owner, but also it would have kind of hipsters playing pool at the same time, or often it would be the space would be shared or only taken over for a few hours. But then the most interesting are these places, members clubs, which are, you know, fan-built enterprises. Often, you know, they have their own space, they paint it in their own colors. And this is one from Switzerland, from the outskirts of Basel. And it's a group called Swiss Eagles for Beşiktaş. And they have built a replica terrace in their clubhouse, which they sit on to watch the games. So a very, you know, passionate experience, and one that, you know, they have a monthly member fee of, you know, like 50 francs or whatever to keep and maintain the building. So moving forward, you know, really it's the 21st century when the internet is kind of adopted en masse. And this, I would argue, is a big reason that allows transnational Turkish fan clubs to emerge. I'm going to talk you through an example of one of these clubs based around the team Beşiktaş. This is who I did my research with. But I should say that Fenerbahçe and Galatasaray have there's the same kind of fan clubs, and the same phenomenon is at work with them, and even some smaller Turkish clubs. So anyway, in case you're not aware, Beşiktaş, one of Turkey's largest clubs, they have millions, they're based in Istanbul. They have millions of fans across Turkey. The big three, Beşiktaş, Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe, have fans across Turkey, really. 90% of people support one of the three. And they also, obviously, then have hundreds of thousands of fans in Turkish-speaking communities in Europe. But the group I'm going to be looking at, which are called Çarşı Berlin, I'll explain more in a second, they have maybe 600 to 700 people who are kind of members. It's loose-knit, but roughly about that. So the name is called Çarşı Berlin because the group started in Berlin in 2004. But as you can see from these banners, it has branches across many different places. Stuttgart, most of them are in Germany. Stuttgart, Mannheim, Nuremberg. But also there's a group in London, even a passionate fan in Israel who has started one. And Holland is the bottom right. So this is the largest transnational fan club for Beşiktaş. So what do these fans... So they travel to games in the Champions League or the Europa League. They organize tickets. They organize the chants. What do? They first of all, physical travel to games, obviously. They arrange buses, coaches, get in the bus, travel to the game, congregate, go to the stadium, cheer on the team, and then when you're exhausted, travel home in, with no sleep. So that's the main event, obviously, around which the fandom is created. And this is itself a border-crossing practice, and it's also something I'm not going to talk about very much, but in order to do this, you can't have a Turkish passport, because, or it's quite difficult. You need a Schengen area passport, really, or a Schengen area passport makes it a lot easier, because there's no visa cost, there's no passport check often. You can just get in a car and drive. And it's a lot more difficult for fans from Turkey to go to games in Europe because if they, the visas are expensive, they're difficult to get, and it prevents a lot of fans going to games from Turkey to Europe. So when we're talking about borders, this is a very important, passports are very important to this phenomenon. But also, there's a lot of circulation of media for obvious reasons. We have a lot of, here, I'm going to talk through some of these in a minute. Websites, Facebook, WhatsApp messages. This is also an important way through which the group coordinates. So the group have a web forum, and it is password protected and closed to the wider world. You need to become a member in order to do this. So it's a very small space, limited to the club, the fan club. And I became a member of this. I was part of this. Yep. And inside here, conversation, as I say here, it's kind of quite a conservative diaspora interaction. And by that, I mean it's a bit like the backstage, if you talk of like Goffman, and this idea of kind of being behind the scenes, often they would be planning the pyro at the games and sorting out disputes, and there'd be a lot of arguments, but they were kept behind closed doors in order to not be displayed to the public. And an important part of creating that space was the use of Turkish. So even though a lot of these people are born and raised in Europe, and their German or their English or their French is potentially better than their Turkish, this space was very much strictly Turkish. And the administrator, this is like posted a GIF here which says, beware, take ownership of your language, of your culture. And it quotes, a famous phrase of Mustafa Kemal, the founder of modern Turkey, about, sort of language being, needing to save your language and it being the bedrock of the nation. So if people speak in German or write in German, often they will get, their messages will be erased, and they'll say, write in Turkish, or they'll correct them, depending on what it is. Be like, no, look, please write in Turkish. So it's quite strict. But it's not the only space. Fans from Çarşı Berlin are often quite active in what I call like ultras websites. So this one is called Ultras Tifo. It's quite a large website where kind of ultras fans from across the world post videos and engage in conversation about, being a passionate fan. And here, obviously, this allows for a more, what I call, cosmopolitan form of interaction, and Turkish football fans are coming into contact with Greek football fans, or, German football fans, French football fans. And in order to be successful in this space, you need a very different skill set. So, like, for instance, this is a post from one of them, and this guy is, for one, he's posting in English, right? And he's saying, I'm not talking about mentality. Yes, there are mixed Turkish fans in most of the games in Germany. However, Germans can't get into their own stadium because of this. Germans watch on TV, Turks watch in the stadium. Çarşı Berlin didn't allow this mixed colors thing in many cities. So, you need to have good English in order to be successful in this. You need to also have impressive photos. You need to have a certain braggadocio. You need to be able to hold your own, basically. Otherwise, you'll be, mocked or humiliated. And it reminds me of, there's a scholar called Mary Louise Pratt who came up with the idea of the contact zone. I mean, she was a literary scholar, but what she was saying was that actually these points where different societies and cultures come together, they're not always harmonious, you know, kumbaya places. They're often, these mixings are very contentious, and she calls it a contact zone, and I like that because I quite like the connotations that the phrase kind of conjures up. And this board, this Ultras board, and it really contains that notion. I'm happy to go into more detail in questions. And then, so finally, there's also Facebook is obviously hugely important to, you know, everyone's lives, and especially the lives of people in this fan club. So there's a lot more flexibility in Facebook because, as we're all aware, most people's on Facebook, people have friends, family members, as well as, you know, kind of associated hangers-on or whatever. So, you know, posting only in Turkish would be quite hard to sustain here, and where, you know, your mum might see your post and might like it or whatever. So anyway, here's a good example, and it's from the London group, and a fan has got a new iPhone case made. And you can see from the comments here that him and his friends post in like a mixture of like Turkish and English. It's like, beklediğimden güzel çıkmış bro. It's like, bir de gerçek görsen, it's even better. I'll show you when we buck up. And he's saying, you know, like, yeah, when you see it in the flesh, it's even better. But this complete mixing of English and Turkish. And it's playful, and there's no limits on it. And this is how these fans, most of these fans talk and act in general life as well. They mix all the time. So sort of weaving my way towards a bit of a conclusion. Like, where should we kind of locate these diaspora Beşiktaş fans? And there seem to be kind of what I call two theirs there. What I mean by that is you have people in the flesh, in a bar, in this case in Nuremberg. Okay, but then you also have people taking pictures of the bar in Nuremberg. So at the same time, they're also in an online space. And for those of you who are scholars of media or anything like this is not particularly, you know, insightful. All of our lives are kind of taking place in multiple spaces at once. And this is historical. I mean, you read a newspaper in the morning and you're kind of in two spaces. You're in the space of the national, you know, Benedict Anderson, who talks about imaginations, talks about this. You're in the imagined space of the newspaper with its who selects the stories to give an idea of who you belong to, but you're also in whichever physical space you're in. But there's a difference very much between a newspaper and Facebook. And for me, the difference is to do with interactivity and time. So as you can see from the timestamps of the comments, they are taking place at the same time, in real time, 11 minutes, 9 minutes, 8 minutes. You know, people post and they expect instant responses. So there's a greater interactivity at a faster rate. And this is not a small thing. This, I would argue, changes notions of space and time, actually. You feel very differently about the world you live in and the people who are part of your networks if you can summon them at any minute by picking out your phone. So the emergence of this fan group, which I've been talking to you about, it's based around these new spatial and temporal arrangements. So Çarşı Berlin, this group, was founded in 2004. You know, it's no coincidence that is, you know, before that time there wasn't really, you know, internet message or maybe in the 1990s there was, but, you know, internet message forums, internet groupings were not especially old at that time. And my argument is that this group is intimately linked to this form of technology. And just to give you a couple of examples of kind of, the result of it is an ever-expanding list of spaces in which Çarşı Berlin have to prove themselves. So if you wanted to be a fan in the 1970s or 80s, you'd have to show yourself in the stadium, you know, maybe down the pub before the game, but then you'd leave your friends at 11 o'clock at night, you'd get the bus home, and that would be it until, you know, next Saturday or whatever, or whenever you meet up. Now, obviously, you know, you get the bus home and you're already getting pestered on your phone to post the video of the event, to engage in the conversation for the next group. And it's not all bad. This obviously generates this community. You know, without it, it wouldn't exist. You know, there's more travel, like, you know, cheap flights across Europe, passport-free travel, internet, you know, more games, more travel, more fun. It's good, you know. These are some pictures of different branches. So when, for the derby match against Fenerbahce, all the groups posted pictures of themselves before from their various locations, and it generates a sense of, you know, transnational community. Here we all are. You're in London, I'm in Germany, you're in Switzerland, and we're all, at this one moment, we're all doing the same thing. And that's a really powerful, that's why we do this, you know, that's why we go to football matches and music concerts, a sense of community as a larger factor. But obviously, it also, communities have their downsides. The fact that there are more activities, that there are more expectations on fans, and it leads to a very argumentative sphere. There are a lot of arguments, both physical, as you can see here. This is an argument between Beşiktaş fans. You know, this is not rivals, this is within the group. And at these matches, there is always a fight amongst the Beşiktaş fans. So it's a very fractured space when you've got, you know, someone from London and someone from Holland and someone from Turkey all trying to be fans. There's also, you know, who's in charge, who should lead the chants, who's doing it right. It's a very contested space. And then on the right is the same, obviously, on Facebook. It's full of arguments, and I won't talk you through this one in many details, but basically there's a huge argument over like a banner, and someone stole the banner, and it's often very petty, but it takes place on the online realm as well. So I'm going to leave it there. I just kind of wanted to try and show you this phenomenon. Obviously, there's a whole raft of kind of theoretical and structure but behind what I do, but I didn't really want to get into that given the idea that this is meant to be a sort of non-academic presentation. But I'm happy to talk a bit more about some of the deeper ideas behind the thesis in questions. But thank you all for listening.
Okay, our next speaker will be Manasseh Chinwasi.
Good morning. My name is Manasseh Kuzaichweshe. I am from, I don't know how you move this. Okay, I am from Zimbabwe. On the map, you see that little bitty tiny country right at the bottom of Africa. It's an interesting place for those who follow politics. We have got a 93-year-old president who's running again next year. And he's a very ardent supporter, a big supporter of Chelsea. So what I'm going to talk to you about today basically is transnational soccer fan identities and cultures in Zimbabwe. Globalization, localization, appropriation, and hybridization. So I'm going to leave out all the theoretical issues around all those concepts and just speak about fans and what they do. Why do they become fans of teams that are so far away? Because one of the things, talking to fans of European football in Zimbabwe, one of the things that they face over time has been, how come you support Arsenal and you have never been out of Harare, which is the capital of Zimbabwe? Why would you support people who don't know you, who you will never meet in your life? How is that possible? How is that connection made? Why would you become so committed to a team that is so far away from where you are, right? And we've got reports in Kenya, for example, in Zimbabwe, the fans are a bit less committed, maybe. Because in Kenya, in the past 5-6 years, there have been 4 to 5 suicides of people who kill themselves after a match, mainly Arsenal supporters. You know Arsenal. So you get that, that element. So my presentation is going to look at the process of becoming a fan. Are you real fans? Answering that question. Then consumption and access to football, practices and behaviors, social media and second screen fan practices. Then a bit around the gender dimensions of fandoms and impact of international, transnational fandoms on local football. Before I go on, like everyone else, I want to thank you for this opportunity to stand before you. When I started doing studies on football, I started when I was doing my master's. My master's was 2 years. We have got the first year of taught courses. During that year, you need to find a research topic. And it was difficult for me to come up with a research topic over that year. Until I came across the work of Richard Giulianotti and Gary Armstrong writing about football in Africa. Giulianotti had a chapter on Zimbabwean football. So that was the first time I came across that, hey, you can study football and this can be an interesting aspect around studying that. So I would like to thank him for that. I would also like to thank Lilian Thuram. 1998, I lost a lunch and a breakfast after a bet that France was going to lose against Croatia in the semifinals of the World Cup. Then a right back came from Norway to score the winning goal. So you owe me a lunch. Yeah. But also that, to say that also the France 98 team, something else. In Africa, people are always telling us, when is Africa going to win the World Cup? If you ask Africans, they will tell you, we've already won the World Cup. 1998. We lifted the France, the trophy in France. So my presentation is going to look at that. So let's look at the process first. This was just a Google map to show you which teams are dominant mainly across the world in terms of searches. And in Africa, you will see that Manchester United, as in Zimbabwe, United is very, very popular. Right. The first reason why, from my studies, because this is based on interviews, on ethnographic study with Zimbabweans who watch European football, and Zimbabweans who watch football in general, per se. So I was focusing on bars, everyday spaces where people meet to talk about football, and also online, as you will see later on, looking at cyber ethnography. But one of the reasons that was coming out was the influence of Zimbabweans who have played in the Premier League. We have got the jungle man on top, Bruce Grobler, still very popular in Zimbabwe, although later on in his career he had scandals around match fixing. We have got Peter Ndlovu, the flying elephant, the greatest Zimbabwean player according to some. Then at the bottom, Benjani Marwari, he played for Portsmouth, then also Manchester City. So these people have been crucial and important for fans so that they can at least see some of their own playing in these leagues, and then they can be, especially for Bruce Grobler. Most of the older generation are Liverpool fans because of him. They could relate to him, right? Then also, secondly, the influence of African players. Here I've just taken 4 of my favorite, but there's a whole list of African players that have come through and have been an influence in terms of belonging, and people, they could see that there are Africans also playing in these leagues. My personal favorite of all time played for Bolton, J.J. Okocha. So good they nicked him twice. Yeah. Then you have Samuel Eto'o and Didier Drogba. Didier Drogba is, I think, the single most reason why most Zimbabweans support Chelsea right now. Because Chelsea did not have many supporters before the Abramovich revolution, and Didier Drogba came in. He is that big in Zimbabwe. So the influence of seeing Africans in these leagues also is another reason why people tend to these fandoms. Then socialization into fandom. For younger fans, you are socialized into fandom by your fathers, uncles, mothers, all the important figures. For example, through birthday cakes, you see, you dress your little kids in these jerseys So here I've got an example of my uncle, Uncle Eric, and his daughter. She was brought up Liverpool. From the day she was born, she would wear Liverpool jerseys and Liverpool clothes and things like that. So there is this element of socialization into a fund that ultimately you are more likely to support the team that your father or a significant person in your life also supports. So there is that element. So we expect maybe in the near future to have more Madrid and Barcelona fans in Zimbabwe, as these teams are also becoming important. Then also the rise of digital television, as the previous speakers have spoken about, that the issue of access to these games. Before 2000, there was a lot of regulation in terms of access to football across sub-Saharan Africa. But after 2000, there's been an opening up of markets. You see more players. But in sub-Saharan Africa, especially Southern Africa, the biggest holder of television rights is SuperSport, which is a DSTV company. And the Premier League itself runs a program where fans come in and you can call into studios in London. And this has also increased access to football and also increased fandom. Then from my interviews, there are certain things that I just picked up, such certain quotations that people are talking about, as I talk to them about why they became fans. For example, one would say that I became a Liverpool fan because my father was also a Liverpool fan. Then another one, my support for Manchester United was largely influenced by the fact that I started watching football at a time the team was very successful and glamorous. So they were attracted by that success. For someone else, they support Arsenal because Arsene Wenger, over the years, has given a chance to African players. Manko Kanu, Lorraine Tamimaya, over the years. So there is that element that Arsenal and Arsene Wenger has done a lot for them. Then also someone says that they support Barcelona because of the type of play. Then another one says that the moment they had the cop, the Liverpool fans singing "You Never Walk Alone," that's the day they fell in love with Liverpool and football. So there are these various reasons why people become fans in a way. Then the second question, one of the respondents said, "My wife is always asking me about my support for Manchester United. She does not understand how a grown man who has never been out of Zimbabwe can become so attracted to a team that plays in England." So there are these elements that you're always being asked, are you a real fan? Why would you support a team that is so far away, right? So one of the issues that comes up when you're looking at literature on European football fandoms in Africa is what is known as the electronic colonialism theory, that you are stupid fans, stupid people who follow a team that is very far away. You are being abused and used by the global neoliberal market to propel a system that does not even recognize you. So there is that. But these fans also push back, saying, we are not stupid people. We are not easily influenced by television to follow certain things. I follow football because I love it, and I follow Chelsea because it is in my heart, right? So they are pushing back against this element that you are fickle, you are easily misled by the global media system, as it were. I'm sorry, but I'm going fast because there's just so much that I have, so. All right. Then there's the element around fan identities and practices, right? There is just so much, from scarves to body paintings to flares. The famous Vuvuzela, we picked that up from South Africa way before the World Cup. It's now part of the Zimbabwean fan culture. So we have picked up a lot from outside, from outside practices. But you also see local practices and beliefs go into these fandoms. For example, praying before matches. You see, when you watch these games in bars, you see Chelsea or Manchester United fans actually going down on their knees in a bar, praying for victory, especially when they are big games. So you see a lot of local practices coming into this these fandoms. Then you also see localization of rivalries, like the Manchester United versus Liverpool rivalry. It plays out. It was interesting to hear from India how the fans would come together to celebrate the Munich disaster. Actually, in Zimbabwe, it plays out like it does in England, that the Liverpool fans, at times, you know, when you want to mock a Manchester United fan, you do the aeroplane, which is very tasteless in a way, but also the Manchester United fans are very good at also eating back. So you see a lot of these things in terms of the localization of rivalries. Then you also have localized nicknames for these teams. For example, Chelsea is called Chela. I don't know what it means, but it's a shortcut of Chelsea. Man United, though the fans don't like it, are called Manure. So there are so many of these. Liverpool is Liver. So there is a localization of these names in terms of how fans are appropriating these fans. Then there's also fan groups that are emerging, not as organized as in India before, but these are also emerging, where fans are actually meeting in the cyber, organizing in the cyber and meeting physically. Cyber groups of Manchester United fans in Zimbabwe, Chelsea fans in Zimbabwe, then they will say that the next game we are watching it at a certain bar, they congregate there, they drink, eat meat, and watch the games together. So you're seeing more and more of that organization happening amongst these fans within these spaces, right? Then the access to these spaces in football now is that Akinders talks about translocal stadiums. We have seen the emergence of what we call translocal stadiums, bars, specialized football, video theaters, households. So there are so many spaces in which football is being consumed across Zimbabwe. Even in rural spaces, some spaces that you never think the English Premier League is known or the Spanish League is known, it's getting there because of satellite television. So some of the most remote spaces in Zimbabwe, they are also getting access to these games. Right. Another important and emerging space to watch football are betting houses, which we call soccer bets, which are also emerging as a space where people come to congregate and bet on the games and also watch football. Right. Then there's the gender dimensions to this transnational football fandom. My work on Zimbabwean football also talks about, I have an interesting paper that talks about gender and women's access to footballing spaces in Zimbabwe locally. But also when it comes to transnational spaces, most of the spaces where football is watched, like bars, in a patriarchal society are not places where good women, I say that in quotes, or proper women would be found. So you find that it's mainly male-dominated, and there are less women within these spaces. And also there's this element that female fans are often addressed as ignorant girlfriends, wives, or friends, daughters of those that know football. So if a woman is seen in these spaces, she's either a girlfriend or a wife who is just coming with the partner, right? So, but you find that the women that I came across, they are very passionate about their game. They know their football. They are as much fans as the male fans. Then social media and the rise of the second screen phenomenon. The second screen phenomenon is basically, we are saying that whilst you're watching football, which is the screen on TV, you have got another screen in your hand, which is your phone. So you're constantly interacting with the game on TV and also interacting with the game on your phone. And we see the emergence of this, like the use of Facebook, WhatsApp platforms, as has been shown before, has increased in Zimbabwe. I did an interesting case study, which is not really here, about Messi versus Ronaldo in second screen practices. The last Clasico last year, Barcelona won 3-2, I think. And when Messi scored, he took out the jersey and So I was looking at the interactions online on Zimbabwean WhatsApp and Facebook groups around that event and what was being said. There was a lot of talk. As the game was going on, people were already interacting around those issues, talking about that statement. In a patriarchal society, Barcelona fans would say that what Messi simply did was come into someone's house, slept with your wife, then washed his panties and place them on the washing line. So it was acrimonious within such spaces, right? So you come back this year, Ronaldo scores in the the cup. He does the same at the Bernabeu. Then there was another debate that he's now copying Messi, and then the Madrid fans were saying, no, Marcelo studied it. And so there's a lot of sharing as the games are going on, as things are happening around these matches. So you find that there is this interaction that is happening beyond simply watching on television, but there's also this emergence of a second screen, right? Lastly, I just want to talk about the impact of transnational fan identities on local football. Basically, the attendances for local games in Zimbabwe has been going down over time. Around the mid-1990s to the late 1990s, we had high attendances, but now an average game attracts 920 people per game. And that also gives a false picture, because that 920 is only propped up because the two teams, Highlanders and Dynamos, that attract an average of 9,000 to 8,000 per game. But the smaller teams are attracting less and less people. And people are saying, why should I go and watch a local game sitting on a concrete slab when I can enjoy the English Premier League and watch Lionel Messi, watch Cristiano Ronaldo, watch Manchester United in a bar which is refreshed? And so there are these elements that especially for the English Premier League, the time clashes with local football. English Premier League on a Sunday, game started 12 in Zimbabwe, the end around 7. Local game started 3. So if United is playing Arsenal at 2 in the afternoon or at 5 in the afternoon, most people are not going to the local game. So the local game is suffering because of that. So I'm not saying that transnational fandoms are singularly responsible for that, because the decline has been going on over years because of maladministration, corruption in football, poor facilities that are within our games. So, but this is also a factor in terms of the low attendances. So I've tried to just compact my presentation within that. There's a lot that I can say if you are interested in knowing more around this topic. But lastly, let me just advertise my new book, which came out this week. All right. It's available on Amazon and also African Books Initiative, the People's Game Football Fandom in Zimbabwe, basically looking at football fans in Zimbabwe and how they organize around football. So thank you very much.
I thought in the interest of time, I'm going to try to do a little bit of synthesis here. So the first thing I was struck by, until Manasse's presentation, where were the women? There seems to be sort of a lot of male bonding going on here in both local spaces and in transnational spaces. So I wonder, thinking about the gender element in all of this might be a very serious consideration in thinking about how sort of fandom ends up being constructed. 2, brokerage. I was struck in Tamar's presentation by the idea that the Qataris were the ones who were doing the brokerage. I mean, they're the ones who had some sort of knowledge in Afghanistan, and they seemed to be able to negotiate the relationship between the young boy, Murtaza, and the FC Barcelona Foundation. And it's sort of, there were all sorts of other sort of brokerage arrangements going on, bus companies, bars. You know, these are people who kind of put people together. So who are the agents? I mean, where is the agency in this whole thing, and how do people negotiate these relationships? The third was the aesthetic, and that came out of Rohan's presentation. The idea of, well, it actually came out of Rohan's and Tamar's presentation, the idea that the aesthetic, that when you saw those Chelsea spaces, they tend to be more groomed, they tend to be more sort of transnational spaces, global spaces, as opposed to the spaces that were held by the Ultra Club from Calcutta. So I mean, I think about the way that these sort of, the aesthetic of spaces and how that sort of creates a certain type of desire and a certain type of cultural sort of satisfaction. And the other one was technology, which were sort of interwoven into the presentations, into John's, into Manasseh's presentation. I kind of wondered, as we become more virtual, right? I mean, is Amazon going to become sort of the arbiter of who we root for? As they sort of, our preferences and you know, is this where these types of arrangements are going to end up being negotiated? Is through these big internet giants. And then some sort of smaller points, I mean sort of general questions about this. I wonder how emotion, the role it plays in the sort of creation of both the sort of these global desires and these and these local desires. I mean, Rohan, you had talked about how these are shared spaces. So how does the global and the local compete, and what's the emotional component of that? I mean, what types of desires do people have to sort of participate in what, you know, I think you would consider to be these mixed spaces? Contact zones. So John, you had mentioned the idea of sort of contact zones, the work of Mary Pratt, and I wonder how broadly we can begin to think of those contact zones. I mean, what, you know, as we sort of move into a virtual world, what makes the contact zones of the virtual world different than the physical spaces? It seems, I mean, does that, you know, getting back to this question of gender, does that sort of define, is that a new way of sort of defining gendered spaces? A contact zone online as opposed to a contact zone, you know, in a bar. I mean, I get the whole bar thing. I like the bar thing, you know. Sometimes when I want to go out with my Barca friends, we have to go to a bar because we need that sort of super male experience. And the other thing is this, you know, I have to say this because with Christian and Lilian here, I have to say this, is that there's this, you know, getting back to this idea of sort of this male desire. I mean, we fawn over these guys, right? I mean, they're our heroes. We want to be like them, right? You know, I don't know, is it we feel like kind of nerdy academics and you know, this is sort of a vetting process that we need to go through. But you know, I think that athletes sort of hold this sort of huge sort of appeal, and whether it be in a jersey, right? Where this sort of young boy, you know, ends up creating his own jersey, which is another sort of aestheticized type of space, the jersey itself, as opposed to, and Tamar, the jerseys aren't 75 euros, they're 125 euros. Okay, just to set you straight. I was just in the Barca shop like 2 weeks ago, and it's 125 euros. Okay, and I guess, also, you know, clothing, sort of thinking about your idea of sort of clothing as a particular sort of space, both a globalized space and sort of a localized space, something where you've sort of put together that jersey. So we might want to think again, you know, who are going to ultimately be the brokers of this clothing? You know, how does that clothing get sold? What type of clothing do we want? I must admit, the jerseys are too expensive. You got to bring the prices down. So if I'll end up supporting a team who has cheap jerseys someday, right? Because I can't buy jerseys. Just a shout out to Darren here. I noticed Arsenal, you know, former communist countries did really well. I wonder if anybody's ever done a study on that. Okay, well, so if, you know, maybe you could sort of respond to some of my comments, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Yes. Thank
you. Can I go? Is this on? Yeah, great.
Just a quick one about heroes. I don't want to put down Christian and Lilian, but often these fans, they actually didn't really care about the players, often. And sometimes after games, I would be, you know, I quite like football, and I'd try and engage people in the game, in talking about the games, and often people were not interested. Never, you know, they didn't really want to dissect the game before the game. They didn't really want to engage in thinking about who's going to be playing, who's going to be in the first 11, what formation are they going to be, like they didn't, not even at level of, oh, I really like X. No, what were they talking about? Oh, like, X isn't coming because he has to work late, or, oh, there was a big fight last time between Y and Z, and they're going to have an issue. And it's almost as if, like, I don't know, like the football is the prop for the communality, and especially to tie it in with gender. And you're absolutely right. And in my thesis, I do have a chapter which explores it, and the issue of it's a very male space. Just, you know, 20 minutes. I didn't really want to go down that path, but you know, often it's, you know, men in various places. I don't know, the spaces in which they can and the ways in which they can express liking for each other are often more limited. And I think football often acts as a prop. It generates a space and an event in which, like, almost by default, men can kind of be like, I like you, you know, and I like hanging out with you, but you can't kind of say that. So you just say, let's go and watch the Barcelona match, and then you know. So yeah, that was just a few thoughts, and I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, you sort of raised that point. Is it sort of an acceptable way of men getting together? I mean, is it just a way that, you know, you don't... So I'll tell you a very brief story. Years ago, I was at a baseball game, and there was two guys sitting behind me, two men, and they'd gone to baseball games the whole weekend, and were trying to figure out how long they could go without seeing their wives, because they just wanted to be with their male friends. So I wonder if there's a little bit of that in it. You know, it's just this deep desire to be with men, and it ends up as a male proving space.
Sorry. I have some general comments to all of us to think. I think one of what we can really profit from or gain from, not profit but gain, is to use theories of social movement, new social movements. Because in all what was here, there is the idea that it's grassroots social movement in many ways, in your paper, a little bit in your paper too, of course, and in my paper, in a way. Actually, mine is the opposite. But I study fan-owned clubs, and all of them are based on social movement. But I think the phenomenon of social movements exists also in other clubs, among fans. So that's one of new social movement. You know, there is new theory and very interesting. So that is one of my ideas about trying to understand fandom today by applying social movement theory to fandom studies, especially. The other comment is about all this idea of Lefebvre and space, and all this idea about the right to the city. I think it appeared in your paper, and also a little bit in the other paper, who owns the club and who owns the city. And all this tension between clubs regarding who owns the city, who is, it's very, very strong in Jerusalem between the right and the wing, the right and the left, sorry. And to whom is the city belongs. And I think this is another idea which is transnational and locality and the belonging of the city. I mean, they cross the city, not only the boundaries. So, and the third thing I thought it's about, of course, we talk a lot about emotions. And I think there is not enough work, as far as I know, about emotions and football. Theories of sociology of emotion, psychology of emotion, anthropology of emotion, and all this. And there are many, many levels of the emotions. It's the level of the emotion changing in one game, which is absolutely fascinating. In a one game, we change about 10 times our emotions. We can cry, we can laugh, we can jump, we can do all kinds of things. And I think there is very little about the emotional expression or practices that we use. And then there are emotions here and in all these talks, and I think that can be...
Well, do you think, I mean, don't you think this sort of these emotional connections really are at the core of...
They are in all of us, but I think we could kind of gain much intellectually if we look at it too closely and put it in the center. Right. Emotions and relations, you know, all right. kind of, and emotions between fathers and children. That I mean,
because it seems that, you know, just being a fan and participating with a group of fans, and as you said, the ups and the downs, the range of emotions one's experiences in a match. I mean, but there's some desire to put ourselves in that state to actually feel something, yeah. right?
Yeah.
To actually, you know, to live with the chances of winning and losing. Yeah.
You have to, especially you have to live with being a loser.
Well,
that's very difficult.
I try to avoid that with the teams I root for.
Nah, yeah, but it's part of all of us.
That's why I'm not a Scunthorpe fan or something like that.
Of course, you know gender. I have been studied, I have been written now many articles and a book about gender and fandom. And I think, of course, it appeared somehow in all papers, but it's not only masculinity. I think women gain a lot from football when they go to matches, because for my study, they can do whatever they want. It's very different from the role outside the stadium. In the stadiums, there are less obligations. The only obligation is to try to imitate men because they own the practices. Historically, the stadium or the fandom is owned by men, and they have a feeling of ownership. So women, many times, for my research, don't care. They own the research, let they have it. We come here and we are more free to do whatever we want in the stadium. And there's not, I think, looking not always on masculinity, but looking at women fans that are celebrating freedom in the stadium, which is, I think, nobody looks at it in this way. So there are many things, and also women. There are no women in your groups.
There are. Yeah, few. Yeah.
And they imitate the men. They drink, they shout, they.
Yeah, it's a quite complicated process of some of kind of you know, often forced into or seen as, you know, having to drink similar amounts in order to be taken seriously. Others less so. It's a real variegated kind of experience. But it's absolutely essential, and you can't talk about these experiences, you know, again, going back to sort of like yin and yang, and very much even, you know, even settings which seem exclusively male. Like you're absolutely right. The image of women and what women are and why or why not they are here is absolutely integral to the process and has to be dealt with. And yeah, I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I don't, because I very much do. But
no. We have to look for a model for women fandom, because there is a model of a man, but there is never a
Sven and then Leanne and then, yeah.
Okay, these were really, really fascinating papers. Thank you so much for sharing them. And I was thinking back to our first conference on soccer, which you, except for Tamara, did not attend. But one of the issues that was raised then, when we looked often at the earlier history of soccer, in the 19th century history or the early 20th century history of soccer, we often talked about the issue of social class, right, which is so important to the early history of soccer. And now I wonder, is it still important, and how is it important? How is the issue of class reflected in this issue of this kind of transnational communities of soccer fandom? Do certain clubs attract certain social strata, in particular societies? Are these fan clubs themselves in some way socially stratified? And maybe this is one basis of these conflicts. Or does the issue of class in a kind of global consumer culture not play a role any longer? So I just wanted you to speculate, in the light of the earlier history of soccer and how we have analyzed it, how to understand the present of soccer in terms of the issue of class. Thank you.
Can I
Yeah. Leanne? Yeah. What? Do you want them to respond? What? No. Or just, yeah. I mean, no, why don't we just take the questions and then yeah, let's take the questions and then respond. Yeah.
Put it to my mouth. Many of you talked about the organization starting from the ground up. Has there been discussions of co-opting from the top down? Is there an opportunity for institutions, whether they be political, economic, movements that might be radical, trying to find one of these clubs and taking them to make it their own, co-opting their message so that it changes the reason for the formation? And if so, what is the role of the social movement theory, right? You know, of the grassroots mobilization to either stop that, or do then we see class issues take place as a result of it? Is there splintering within the clubs around these kind of issues that supposedly were formed from this kind of, you know, I don't want to say, or just a love of the game, right? You know, this is the love of the game, the fun, John, that you talked about, right? Just connecting back to your point.
Okay, who else? Yes, Elizabeth.
Hi, I just had a question for John, and it sort of connects to what, Steve, you were saying about this aesthetic space. And I was wondering, I don't know if I'm showing my ignorance for not knowing this, but why the Turkish fan club's A is the anarchy A. And I just thought that was really interesting. And a quick Google search told me that they like slightly changed the A, but so just interested in that, and sort of this connects to what someone was talking about, the appropriation of symbols and stuff like that.
So we have two more. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think Manesh showed us quite carefully how we become fans and why we become fans, and Steven said something about male bonding, which I think is very important. It's a connection, it's an identity, maybe even a primary identity. For Turkish football fans, it's very strong. It's a very strong loyalty to one club. My question is, if I watch Turkish fans in a Dutch connection in international teams, for example, when a Dutch team plays against a Turkish team, so all the Turkish diaspora people would support the Turkish team. But then if they are kicked out of the tournament, they easily switch to the Dutch national team. It's no problem. And I mean, we are, you know, not even discussing it. It's natural, we suppose. But the thing is, why am I less a Liverpool fan if I switch weekly from Liverpool to Man United? Because there it's not allowed. You know, I'm less of a Liverpool fan if I, you know, shift loyalty every week. So my question would be, especially to Rowan and John and Manesh, in the context, you know, am I allowed to switch loyalty of fans, or am I less of a fan, and why is this so?
More questions?
Yeah, we'll take. Okay, yeah, we'll take two more, and then we'll take two more.
Well, first, thank you all. Those are all really interesting papers, and this is a comment, not a question, but I was interested that Steve told the story about the gentleman at the ball game behind him and talking about the male experience, and John talking about that so often these fans of the Turkish club, they were not interested in the formation, they were not interested in the details, they were interested in getting together. There are so many reasons that we become fans, and I think Manesh came closest to talking about one of the reasons that I personally have stayed a sports fan for my whole life. And I think that the older that I am, the more I'm interested in social justice. And I find that the sports arena is the closest thing that I know of in the world to a meritocracy. And in the United States, the Major League Baseball was the most popular sport for most of the 20th century. And players of color could not play in the major leagues until 1947, or I shouldn't say players of African Americans could not play until 1947. And what you found that once that African American players could play, the teams that accepted these players were the better teams. If you are racist in sports, you will simply lose. And this is one of the reasons that I just find it so easy to still be a sports fan after all these years. It's an honorable arena.
Okay, another question to John.
One more.
If I'm not mistaken, Beşiktaş is the working class football club in Turkey or in Istanbul, right? Is that somehow reflected in the transnational fan diaspora? And probably the obvious question concerning the political situation now in Turkey, you refer to also arguments and fights among the transnational supporters. And is the current political situation in Turkey debated or somehow approached among those people?
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes to respond to these.
5 minutes?
5 minutes. So that means
Rohan, why don't you...
That means there are 4 people, that's 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Yeah. So the women's question is something that I am exploring in my thesis. I didn't talk about it in much detail because I felt that I didn't, my ethnography isn't that detailed enough yet to be talking about it. But there is, of course, there are a few all-women's only supporters clubs in Calcutta, which along with being placed alongside this narrative becomes all the more interesting. I didn't explore this in my in the presentation because, well, I wanted to talk about the entire fragmented nature of fandom, and at some level, I agree that it probably should have featured a lot more. The aesthetic question is something that I will definitely think about. I mean, the supporters club of Chelsea has a different set of aesthetic dynamics with regards to the East Bengal Ultras, which ties up very well to Sven's question on social class. I mean, the question of social class is definitely important, but in this context, it is not just class, but it is also caste questions which figure very, very prominently within these supporters clubs, because very often these supporters clubs are started by mostly upper caste men who talk about the question of social caste as something which is fundamentally, or the question of caste which is fundamentally tied to the question of social class in that regard. So global consumer culture and everything along with the caste question is something that I would like to definitely explore. And is it important? Of course it is important. I mean, you cannot possibly have a study of fandom without the class question. And but in order to drive home the question of class, I personally feel that it's more fruitful to place it at the interface of the class-caste question with regards to the backdrop of global consumerism in general. Steve, the question on emotional content is something which features very prominently, actually. I am, conceptually speaking, I'm working with affect, so that is something which talks about, which is slightly different from the emotional context. I didn't want to raise this because it would entail me to go into the theoretical side of it. So the question on internet giants and everything, digital media definitely plays a part, but in the context of East Bengal and a lot of these local clubs, they came in prior to mass media in that context, right? So one of the major mediums of circulation of sport reportage was the newspapers in Calcutta, and this is prior to the internet coming in. But of course, the internet is something which definitely helps in the global scenario of the game. Co-opting, so the question on the top-down, this is something which I will have to think about. I mean, I don't know if there's an immediate response. Maybe we could talk about this outside, but it is something that I would like to think about. And the loyalty question is something, I mean, can you switch? The simple answer is no. I mean, for them, you can't, because for them, I can give an academic response to that, I can give a fan-oriented response to that. The fan-oriented response is that if you really are shifting on a weekly basis, what is it that is specific to your support? I mean, tomorrow something else happens and then you go on, where is your I mean, the question of loyalty is something which needs to be, I mean, understood in that regard. There is an academic response to it as well, which will require me to further explore as to why is it that you cannot be a Liverpool fan one week, a United fan the other week, a Chelsea fan the other week. I mean, I don't know if people will, I mean, take you seriously in that. I mean, the fans themselves will not very often take you seriously. I mean, there was an instance of someone who stopped going to the Chelsea supporters club and he wanted to support something else, and he's been subject to a lot of ridicule when he's not around in the setting itself. So there are instances, but the non-academic one-word response to that would be probably no. I don't know how you can change your loyalty to that. So these would be my very brief responses.
I actually disagree.
Yeah. Me too.
I don't know how many of you are, I kind of would say, you have Simon Cooper and Stefan, someone's name I can't pronounce, the Soconomics book, write quite interestingly about this idea of loyalty, and kind of, we have the fever pitch narrative, and then they sort of quite actively deconstruct that. And often the fever pitch narrative, if you're not aware, Fever Pitch, a book by Nick Hornby about being an Arsenal fan, sold millions of copies. And it really appeals to how we want to see ourselves and how we feel about the game. And we buy into that, and it's very much a really important trope. But if you actually look at how many people who are fans respond to games, that whilst they might not explicitly support multiple teams, there are situations in which loyalty shifts. It's expressed, like, for instance, there was a Besiktas fan who had a Fenerbahce friend, and, you know, one evening we went to watch a Fenerbahce game in the pub, and Fenerbahce scored, and I turned around and he jumped out of his chair and was screaming. He was there in the moment, and that is, you know, in theory that shouldn't happen, but it did. So yeah, I mean, we've not got time. So, but you know, maybe I just wanted to pick out that, like, sorry, right? I don't mean to, like, it's a very complicated question, but for me, I find it's quite important to disentangle how like, you know, how we romanticize or how we want things to be, and how in reality they actually sometimes manifest themselves.
I have two very short things. One to Sven. I think maybe we have to think about cultural capital today, and not so much about class. I think there are questions of cultural capital that are very important, because I don't want to. Yeah, but that's the idea. And the other things I wanted to say is, okay, I don't. We have to go for lunch.
Do you have any? Just to talk about the question around loyalty. It's possible at times to change. I've seen Arsenal supporters who change because of the continued. But it's possible. In Zimbabwe, you are not limited to just English Premier League. You can be a Manchester United supporter, a Real Madrid in Spain, Bayern Munich in Germany. So there are those elements that you can. But now when it comes to the European Champions League, you need to stick to your, you know, your first love anyway. So, but you can also support Stoke when they are playing Arsenal because you don't like Arsenal, or, you know. So there are these shifts in terms of whether you can change. But I think basically that's.
2 seconds, just a minor qualification actually. The question of loyalty, when I said that you basically cannot, I meant it in an organized structure sense of the term. I mean, of course, you can shift loyalties. It becomes a lot more nuanced, but with regards to the organized sense of the term, that is what I feel.
Okay, I think we have to stop. Thank you. We're going to take a 15-minute break, then everybody will come back for the next panel. Thank you so much.
I'm tired. Yeah, I have so many. I decided to.
help yourself.